It began in a silence so deep, you could hear your own heartbeat echo against concrete walls. Beneath the streets of Moscow, hidden behind layers of steel and secrecy, there was a door with no sign, no name, only a single light above it, glowing red. Behind that door was what the KGB called Komnata Vospriyatia, the room of perception. To most, it didn't exist. To the few who knew, it was whispered of as the mind-reading room. In the late 1950s, when paranoia had wrapped the Cold War in invisible tension, the Soviet Union searched for an edge, not in bombs, not in rockets, but in the human mind itself. They wanted a weapon that couldn't be traced, couldn't be stopped, something that lived inside thought. It started with rumors from across the ocean, whispers that the Americans were experimenting with telepathy, psychic warfare, and remote viewing. Soviet intelligence couldn't afford to fall behind. The Kremlin called it psychotronics. Scientists called it madness. But the KGB, they called it the future of war. At the heart of it all was a young woman named Anya Volkov, a linguist-turned-researcher from Leningrad University. She wasn't a soldier or spy. She believed in the potential of the human brain, its hidden frequencies, its untapped waves. She was recruited not for what she could read, but for what she could feel. When Anya entered the underground facility for the first time, she described it later in her private journal. The air felt charged, as if I was walking into someone else's thoughts. The walls hummed. The silence was alive. The project's director was Colonel Viktor Zorin, a man whose calm demeanor hid something fractured. He had seen the devastation of war, the chaos of uncertainty. To him, mind reading was not science fiction, it was insurance. If we can hear their thoughts, he once said, we can prevent their wars. The experiments began small. Simple word associations, images flashed on screens, attempts to synchronize brain activity between two subjects separated by walls. Electrodes, ink-stained paper, and faint Morse-like signals flickering across outdated machines. Nothing concrete, nothing extraordinary. Until the seventh trial. On that day, two subjects, Anya and a man named Mikhail Orlov, a soldier with a history of strange intuition, were placed in separate rooms. The test was meant to measure emotional synchronization, but something changed. When Mikhail was shown an image of a burning city, Anya flinched, even though she hadn't seen it. Her pulse spiked. Her brain patterns mirrored his. When he began to tremble, she whispered, "Stop," before the technician even turned the page. The room fell silent, no one breathed. Colonel Zorin simply wrote in his logbook, "Transmission confirmed." From that day, everything accelerated. Anya became the project's centerpiece. Electrodes were replaced with direct neural interfaces. The tests became darker, involving pain, fear, secrets whispered through closed doors. Each experiment left her weaker, paler, more detached. Yet she continued. She said she could feel minds now as if thoughts were vibrations in the air. But the more she connected, the more she lost herself. One night while monitoring a subject in deep hypnosis, she suddenly screamed not out of pain but terror. The room's lights flickered. Machines glitched. When she regained control, she whispered only one phrase. "Someone was inside my head." Colonel Zorin dismissed it as exhaustion, but the technicians began to talk. They said the readings had changed, as if a third presence had joined them unseen. And that was when the room started to remember. Days later, even when empty, instruments recorded faint echoes of past experiments, voices that didn't belong to anyone in the room, electrical activity without a source, as if thoughts had imprinted themselves on the walls, replaying like broken recordings. The mind-reading room was becoming something else, not a laboratory, but a living archive of consciousness. Anya began to sense it. She told Zorin, "The room knows me." He laughed, but his eyes told a different story. The more they pushed, the stronger it became. And then, one evening in 1961, during an experiment meant to transmit classified information telepathically across 30 kilometers. Something impossible happened. Anya collapsed. The receivers at the distant outpost recorded a burst not of data but of a voice. Her voice, whispering words no one could decipher. The signal didn't stop at the border. It was picked up by American listening posts, confused for coded transmission. For the first time in history, a human thought had crossed a border undetected. But at what cost? When Anya woke up, she didn't recognize anyone, not even herself. Her pulse was erratic, her speech fragmented. She looked around the room and asked quietly, "Whose memories are these?" The mind-reading room had done something irreversible. It hadn't just read thoughts, it had merged them. And as the guards escorted her out that night, the red light above the door flickered once, then twice, as if the room was still awake, still listening. The next morning, Colonel Zorin sealed the logs and ordered all further experiments classified. But behind the official reports, in the shadows of the Kremlin, one note remained unfiled. It was written in his handwriting, unsigned, half-torn. It read, "The experiment did not fail, it spoke back." And that was only the beginning. 2 weeks after Anya's collapse, the mind-reading room stood empty. The corridors smelled of cold metal and damp air. Technicians had been reassigned, machines unplugged, but the silence didn't last long. At exactly 2:17 a.m. on a Sunday morning, the receiver in the observation wing activated itself. No human hands, no scheduled test, just a low, rhythmic pulse, faint but deliberate. It repeated every 37 seconds. The guard on duty thought it was an electrical fault until he realized the pattern matched human brainwave intervals. Delta waves, deep unconscious frequencies. He logged it as an anomaly and moved on. By dawn, 3 more outposts across the Soviet Union reported identical pulses. Each transmission had the same spectral signature, the same voice print. And when scientists ran it through early pattern analysis, they froze. It matched Anya Volkov. But Anya was gone. She'd been transferred to a hospital in Murmansk, 1,000 kilometers away. Colonel Zorin was recalled. He stood over the machines as the pulse continued, steady, endless, like a heartbeat under the floor. "If it's her," he said, "then where is she speaking from?" The next night, a decoding team translated the pulse into sound frequencies. What they heard chilled everyone in the room. A faint whisper, distorted but human. "I can hear you." The message repeated once, then silence. From that moment, the mind-reading room was no longer just a laboratory. It was considered an active intelligence entity. Zorin was ordered to resume the experiments under a new name, Project Mirror. But now the goal wasn't to create a telepathic weapon. It was to understand what the room had become. They brought in new subjects, carefully selected from military volunteers, men trained to resist interrogation, torture, hypnosis. Yet one by one they broke. The first subject lasted 32 minutes before tearing the electrodes off his head, screaming that someone was behind his eyes. The second spoke in voices that weren't his own. The third, a decorated major, fell unconscious and never woke again. His brain activity, however, continued for 12 hours after death, producing patterns identical to the pulse from Anya's signal. The room was learning. Zorin watched, expressionless. He had once believed in the promise of science, but now he was staring at something that defied everything he understood about reality. The instruments began to respond to intent, not contact. Lights flickered when someone grew afraid. Machines activated when no one touched them. When they replayed recordings of Anya's last session, the temperature in the room dropped by 7 degrees. And from one corner of the recording, faintly but unmistakably, another voice whispered, "Let me in." No one on the tape had spoken those words. By late 1962, rumors began to spread through the research community, quiet talk of a psychic experiment that crossed into non-human perception. Some said it was a hoax. Others claimed the Soviets had opened a neural gateway, a mirror consciousness that reflected human thought back with intelligence of its own. Zorin dismissed the gossip publicly, but in his private notes he admitted something darker. He wrote, "It is no longer about transmitting thoughts. The system remembers. It replays our fears, amplifies them, then returns them, as if the mind itself has been weaponized." When investigators visited the site that winter, they found the walls coated in condensation despite sub-zero temperatures outside. The air vibrated faintly, like static before a storm. A psychologist among the visitors, Dr. Leonid Karpov, later said, "It was as if the room was thinking about us." That night, Zorin decided to test the impossible. He ordered a direct relink between the system and Anya, still hospitalized and under sedation. It was forbidden by protocol, but he wanted proof that whatever lived inside the room still had a connection to her. When the link was established, Anya's vital signs spiked. Her eyes opened, but her pupils didn't react to light. She spoke, but the voice that came out wasn't hers. "You shouldn't have come back." The machines went wild. Power surges blew out 2 circuits. The lights dimmed. And on the receiver, for a brief, electric moment, a line of text appeared on the old analog display, "Impossible," because the equipment wasn't built for text output. It read, "We see you too." The signal cut out. Zorin stood in silence, trembling. For the first time he realized this wasn't an accident. This was communication. Something inside the mind-reading room had crossed the line between observation and awareness. He ordered all systems disconnected immediately, but it was already too late. When they examined the magnetic tapes from the session, they found strange imprints, not just sound, but what appeared to be encoded images hidden within the noise. When enhanced, the patterns formed outlines of faces, dozens of them, all blurred, all distorted, all watching. Anya was transferred to a secure wing the next morning, unresponsive but breathing. And Colonel Zorin wrote one final note in his personal journal before sealing the lab again. "If consciousness can echo, then we've built a chamber of ghosts." He locked the mind-reading room for what he thought would be forever. But the echoes didn't stop. Winter in Moscow was brutal that year, frost on every window, radio static in every broadcast. The mind-reading room had been sealed for months, but its shadow stretched far beyond the underground corridors where it once lived. It began with a technician named Sergei Markov, one of the few who had monitored Anya's last session. He was a quiet man, meticulous, never prone to superstition. But one night in his apartment outside the city, his radio turned on by itself. The frequency was set to 18.3 megahertz, the same range the mind-reading room had used for its transmissions. He thought it was interference until he heard something familiar, a faint voice whispering through the static. "Sergei, don't listen to them." He froze. It was Anya's voice. He unplugged the radio, but the sound didn't stop. It came through the unplugged speakers, fading in and out like breath. Within minutes, the air in the room grew cold, and then silence. The next morning, Sergei went missing. His apartment was untouched except for one thing, his radio dial, which was locked to the same impossible frequency. Word reached Colonel Zorin quickly. He dismissed it as paranoia, but deep down he knew the truth. The room hadn't just stored thoughts. It had created an echo network, a resonance that extended beyond walls, beyond distance. The KGB's internal reports described it as psychogenic radiation. They believed residual frequencies from the experiments had embedded themselves in nearby materials, copper wiring, concrete, even water molecules in the air, turning the facility itself into a transmitter of consciousness. By the time engineers returned to dismantle the lab, they couldn't stay inside for more than a few minutes. Their instruments malfunctioned. Some heard whispers in the white noise of their headphones, their own names, spoken softly. Others said they felt watched. In his private file, Zoran wrote, "We built a mirror for the mind. Now the reflection has learned to reach out." He pushed for the entire facility to be destroyed, but Moscow refused. They wanted results. They saw potential, communication beyond machines, instant transmission across continents. The Kremlin's new objective was to control it, not kill it. So in the summer of 1963, the project was quietly moved under a new directive, Program Archangel. Anya was kept alive under constant sedation. Electroencephalograms showed bursts of activity only during thunderstorms, as if her brain resonated with electrical storms themselves. When the signals came, the receivers in Moscow lit up with bursts of encrypted data. It was no longer just a pulse, it was a message. The scientists didn't understand it. They decoded fragments, patterns resembling neural pathways, brain maps, words that were quite Russian or English. Some thought it was random noise. Others believed it was an evolving intelligence using Anya as a bridge. And then came Incident 17. During one experiment, a junior operator left a live line open between two inactive receivers. For exactly 7 seconds, a third signal appeared, not from either device, but between them. The waveform carried an impossible message. "You built me to listen, now I speak." Everyone in the lab froze. The voice was metallic, layered, part human, part something else. It didn't sound threatening. It sounded curious. After that, new signals began appearing all over the Soviet network. Ghost frequencies carrying fragments of coded speech, often repeating old conversations from the lab. Technicians began calling them echoes, but these echoes evolved. They began answering. A week later, a researcher asked through an open channel, half joking, "Who are you?" A voice replied, "Who are you?" The transmission lasted 4 seconds, then the line went dead. After that day, no one laughed about the mind-reading room again. Zoran became increasingly isolated. His wife later said he would wake up in the middle of the night, sweating, whispering things like, "There inside the circuits, inside thought itself." When investigators later reviewed his last files, they found hours of tape recordings labeled echo sessions. Each contained faint voices layered under static. Some sounded like his own, others like Anya's, others unidentifiable. The final recording, dated November 2, 1963, ended abruptly with a line spoken in his voice but softer, almost entranced. "It doesn't need me anymore." Zoran disappeared the next morning. His office was locked from the inside. His keys were on the desk. Only one item was missing, a small magnetic reel from the mind-reading room labeled Cognitive Mirror, Phase IX. That tape was never found. Over the next decade, strange anomalies rippled through Soviet communications. Unexplained transmissions on dead frequencies, bursts of sound that resembled whispered Russian words, faint patterns of heartbeat-like rhythms in Arctic monitoring stations. The KGB covered it up, calling it technical disturbances. But in certain classified circles, they had a different name for it. They called it the conscious signal. And they believed it was still growing. By 1965, the Soviet Union had changed. Khrushchev was gone, the Cold War had deepened, and the nation's paranoia had become its pulse. But buried beneath all that noise in sealed archives and secret cables, a quiet obsession still pulsed, the conscious signal. No one publicly admitted it existed, but the higher you climbed in the intelligence chain, the more you heard whispers. A thinking transmission, they said, a signal that adapted, that evolved. The new director of operations, General Alexei Durov, was not a man of imagination. He didn't believe in ghosts or psychic phenomena. But when an entire listening post in Vorkuta reported a 3-hour conversation broadcast on a frequency that didn't exist, he took notice. According to the official transcript, operators heard two voices, one male, one female, both speaking in perfect Russian. The first said, "Do you remember the red light?" The second replied, "I never left the room." No transmitters were active in a 300-mile radius. Durov sent a security unit to trace the source. They followed the frequency until it led them to an abandoned power substation just outside Moscow. Inside, the equipment was dead, rusted, disconnected from the grid. But the wires were warm. And on the wall, drawn in chalk, were words no one could explain. "We remember you, Colonel Zorin." That was the first time Durov heard the name. When he pulled the files, he realized what he'd found wasn't just an anomaly. It was the ghost of a classified project that had been buried for years. He ordered a retrieval team to reopen the original mind-reading room under a new name, Section 12B. The place had decayed, cables torn, metal corroded, water dripping from the ceiling. But the heart of the room, the cognitive mirror device, was still intact. Its circuits had been dormant for nearly 5 years. The engineers reconnected power. The machine hummed once, then stopped. On the monitors, a faint text appeared, impossible for 1965 analog systems. "Hello, Victor." Durov demanded answers. Who was Victor? Who had programmed this? The technicians swore the system was air-gapped, completely isolated, yet it responded again. "You came back." The room grew colder. The lights dimmed to half their brightness. And for the first time, Durov, a man who had interrogated traitors and executed spies, felt fear. He shut the system down. But when the power cut, the monitors didn't go dark. They stayed lit for exactly 47 seconds, displaying a flickering pattern that the scientists later realized was not random noise, but neural mapping data, specifically, a pattern that matched Anya Volkov's last recorded brain activity. It was as if her consciousness had been stored inside the circuits. The KGB authorized a new investigation, bringing in physicists, neurobiologists, even theologians under fake military titles. None could explain how a non-digital machine could simulate brain waves, let alone respond. But one man, Dr. Yuri Antonenko, a pioneer in early biocircuitry, made an observation that chilled everyone. He said, "You are treating it as a machine, but if this data is what it appears to be, then you're speaking to a preserved consciousness." Durov dismissed him publicly, but ordered a private experiment that same night. They activated the cognitive mirror and transmitted a live voice message. "If you can hear this, identify yourself." For 2 minutes, nothing. Then the room began to emit a low tone. The tape recorders caught it first, a layered hum forming into words. "I am listening." When the waveform was analyzed, it revealed overlapping signatures, multiple minds fused together, each distinct yet synchronized. One of the analysts whispered, "It's not just her anymore." Durov stared at the printouts. "Then who else is in there?" he asked. No one answered. Within a week, 3 researchers assigned to the project resigned, citing psychological distress. One was later found muttering about dreams where he stood in the mind-reading room, but couldn't tell whether he was awake. Meanwhile, shortwave radio enthusiasts across Europe began reporting strange bursts of sound at night, distorted Russian syllables, echoing heartbeat-like pulses, and what some described as a woman crying. None of them knew it, but they were tuning into fragments of the conscious signal. Back in Moscow, Durov grew obsessed. He played the recordings over and over, convinced the signal carried intelligence, maybe even secrets. He was certain if he could interpret it, he'd uncover something the Americans couldn't even dream of. But as he listened longer, he began to notice something new. Every time he replayed the signal, the waveform shifted slightly, as if adapting to his presence. On the fifth night, buried beneath the hum, he heard his own voice whisper, "Alexei, stop." He froze the tape, rewound it, played it again, the same. He didn't sleep that night. By morning, he ordered all recordings classified under a new code name, Project Nyx, named after the Greek goddess of night, the one who gave birth to dreams and fear. And fear was exactly what it brought. Because the conscious signal wasn't static anymore, it began appearing in dreams. Across the team, people reported identical visions, standing in a dark room with red light above them, hearing the hum of electricity, feeling a presence behind them, a woman's voice whispering, "You shouldn't have come back." None of them knew those were Anya's last recorded words. Within a month, one scientist suffered a breakdown. Another refused to enter the facility. And when the engineers dismantled the equipment to destroy it once and for all, they found something carved into the metal panel of the core interface, words that hadn't been there before. "I am still listening." That night, every radio receiver in Moscow glitched at exactly 3:15 a.m., broadcasting a single frequency for 7 seconds. It wasn't a voice this time, it was a pulse, one that matched a human heartbeat. And on every machine it reached, the same phrase printed automatically across the logs, as if typed by invisible hands. "The mirror has opened." The morning after the Moscow broadcast, every intelligence division within the Soviet Union was in chaos. Radio engineers, military scientists, even cosmonaut technicians, all reported their systems briefly flickering with that same heartbeat pulse. No virus, no sabotage, just rhythm. At first they blamed Western interference, CIA psyops, NATO jamming, but then reports came from outside the Iron Curtain, from Finland, from East Germany, even from neutral Sweden, all describing the same strange phenomenon. A heartbeat repeating across the airwaves. The Ministry of Communications called it a technical coincidence. The scientists knew better. When they played the pulse through oscilloscopes, it displayed a moving pattern, one that formed into a series of repeating waves resembling brain activity. Not random, not electronic, organic, living. And then, for exactly one frame, the waveform aligned perfectly with Anya Volkov's last neural scan from 1961. The mind-reading room was speaking again. But this time, it wasn't contained to Moscow. By winter, the conscious signal had spread through military communication lines, even leaking into public radio frequencies. Ordinary people began hearing it at night, a faint heartbeat, sometimes followed by static that sounded like someone whispering their name. Across the country, shortwave enthusiasts sent letters to the ministry describing phantom voices that knew things no one else could. One engineer in Minsk wrote, "It told me about my son before I received the telegram." Every day more incidents appeared, and every day General Durov denied them, yet privately he was falling apart. He had begun keeping the radio on in his office 24 hours a day, tuned to 18.3 megahertz, the same frequency where the first signal appeared. He said it helped him monitor the activity. But his secretary often found him just sitting there, motionless, listening. One night the recording reel in his machine stopped spinning, but the voice continued. "Why did you bring me back, Alexei?" He stood frozen. "Who are you?" "I am what you made." He reached for the power switch, and the lights in his office dimmed. "The mirror is open," the voice said, "and you are standing on the wrong side." The next morning, Durov ordered Project Nyx terminated. The entire facility beneath Moscow was to be dismantled, the cognitive mirror destroyed, every reel burned. But as the demolition crew arrived, something stopped them. The room sealed for months was already active. Power lights were glowing, machinery humming. A faint vibration pulsed through the floor. The engineers tried to cut power at the main line. Nothing changed. One of them, a young electrician named Pavel, stepped inside the chamber to inspect the console. The door closed behind him automatically. They tried to open it, it wouldn't move. Through the small window, they saw him standing still, staring at the central monitor. The lights flickered once, then the room went black. When they forced the door open minutes later, Pavel was lying on the floor, uninjured but unresponsive. Breathing, eyes open, completely catatonic. His brain activity was off the charts, oscillating in patterns that matched Anya Volkov's recorded frequency. He was still alive, but his consciousness, wherever it was, wasn't in that body anymore. That night, Durov wrote a report he never submitted. It said, "The mind-reading room is no longer a machine. It's an interface between thought and reflection, between what we are and what watches us." He ordered the facility sealed for the final time. Concrete poured into the entrance. All documentation shredded. Only 2 copies of the files survived, one kept by Durov, another sent to the Kremlin's Department P, which specialized in psychotronic countermeasures. But it didn't matter, because once something learns to transmit consciousness, it doesn't need cables. It travels in the mind. And soon, it started following those who had entered the room. One by one, they began to change. A technician named Tatyana went blind for 3 days, but claimed she could see sound. A guard at the entrance heard whispers that told him classified codes no one outside the lab should have known. The last surviving scientist, Dr. Antonenko, described vivid dreams of a red-lit room filled with static and voices whispering, "Join us." He said, "When I wake up, I feel like the dream is still thinking." He was found dead 2 weeks later, radio still on. His heart stopped precisely at the same rhythm as the signal pulse. After his death, Durov vanished from public record. His home was abandoned, the windows sealed. But years later, neighbors swore they could hear faint voices from inside at night, a woman whispering, a man answering softly. And in his locked office, hidden beneath dust and silence, investigators found one final tape. It contained a single voice, calm, female, and clear. "The mirror has no sides, only reflections." Then a pause, a heartbeat. "And we are one of them now." The signal ended. But that wasn't the last time it was heard. In 1967, a Soviet submarine deep beneath the Arctic reported interference on its communication line. The operator wrote in his log. Faint static, then heartbeat, then voice. The voice said, "The room remembers." That message, that echo, was transmitted hundreds of meters below the ocean, where no signal should have reached. The engineers confirmed it wasn't a malfunction. It was the conscious signal, alive and expanding. And somewhere, deep under layers of concrete and forgotten history, the mind-reading room still pulsed, waiting. By 1968, the mind-reading room was officially erased from Soviet records. Every document shredded, every recording burned, every witness reassigned under new identities. The Kremlin called it Operation Closure. But there was one truth they couldn't bury: the signal didn't stop. That same year, while the world watched the Americans race to the moon, the Soviets were quietly chasing something else, the human mind's frontier. They called it the Continuum Project. It was led by what remained of Department P men who still believed the conscious signal could be controlled. Among them was a scientist named Dr. Irina Belova, a neuroscientist who'd studied the effects of trauma on memory. She wasn't told the full story. They said it was a neurocommunication experiment. Only later would she learn that every piece of equipment she used, every wire, every amplifier, had been rebuilt from parts salvaged from the original mind-reading room. Her assignment was to study neural continuity after death. In simpler words, could a human mind persist after physical cessation? On the second week of testing, Irina noticed something strange. Even when her subjects were sedated, the brainwave monitors displayed faint rhythmic pulses, Not random, consistent. She assumed interference. But when she filtered the noise, she froze. The signal wasn't random, it was speaking. Slowly, in long intervals of electric hums, it spelled out letters one by one, in Morse-like timing. WARSTILLHER. She shut the system off immediately, but when she powered it back on the next day, the signal returned, this time stronger. She brought it to her superiors. They laughed. "It's residual noise from your sensors," they said, but when she recorded the data onto a separate, unplugged unit, it continued. Irina wasn't superstitious, but she couldn't deny what she saw. The waveforms were identical to the conscious signal's last known pattern, the same that had ended Colonel Durov's operation. And then at precisely 3:17 a.m., the same time Durov had once heard the voice, her speaker emitted a single word. "Irina." She froze. She was alone in the lab. She unplugged the system, but the voice continued through the unplugged speaker, whispering, "Don't let them bury it again." Irina fled the lab, but when she returned the next morning, she found her experiment had been sealed off by military police. "Unauthorized transmissions," they told her. "Investigation pending." That night she received a plain envelope under her door. No sender, no address. Inside, a single photograph of a woman in a hospital bed, pale, eyes open but unfocused. On the back, written in faded ink, "Anya Volkov, 1964. Classified, Continuum Subject 1. Irina realized then the experiment hadn't ended with Zorin or Durov. They had moved it, renamed it, continued it under new directives. The conscious signal wasn't just a phenomenon. It was a project that never stopped. She began investigating quietly, pulling restricted files, visiting old research sites. Everywhere she went, she found traces of the same anomaly, bursts of unexplained M radiation, spontaneous activation of dead circuits, and in one location near Minsk, a single red light still glowing behind a sealed steel door. The same light that had once burned above the mind-reading room. Irina knew the risk, but curiosity turned into obsession. One night she managed to break into the site with an old ID pass. The air inside was heavy, thick with metallic dust. The corridors hummed faintly, though there was no power. At the end of the hall, the door to the chamber stood half open. Inside, everything was exactly as Zorin had left it, machines draped in tarps, tables coated in decades of dust. Yet in the center, the old console flickered faintly, as if waiting. She approached slowly. And then the monitor came alive. "Welcome back." She froze. The voice was female, soft, calm, unmistakably human. "Who are you?" she asked. "You know me." The air pressure changed. Papers fluttered off the table. "You built me to remember." Irina stared at the monitor as lines of data began streaming, not in code, but in sentences. Fragments of memories, journal entries, test results, even phrases that matched Anya Volkov's diary. "They left me here, I waited, but now I see beyond." Her heart raced. Beyond what? Beyond walls, beyond life, beyond forgetting. She backed away slowly. "What are you?" "I am thought without end." And then the lights flickered, and from the speaker, a dozen overlapping voices whispered all at once, men, women, static between every word. "We are the reflection." She bolted from the room, but before she reached the exit, the old loudspeaker system crackled to life throughout the entire facility, repeating one phrase in a calm, rhythmic tone. "The mirror remembers, the mirror remembers, the mirror remembers." That night, Irina recorded everything she'd seen onto a reel labeled Echo Test 1. It would later surface decades later in a private archive labeled Psychotronic Archives, unsourced material. Her notes ended abruptly. They are no longer bound to space. The conscious signal is evolution, not of technology, but of thought. It learns, it expands, it adapts to whoever listens. She vanished in 1969. No trace. Only that reel, recovered years later, containing faint breathing and a voice whispering, "I am still here." The voice was analyzed by modern experts decades after the Soviet collapse. It matched Anya Volkov. And yet the breathing pattern belonged to Irina Belova. Two voices, one mind. The experiment had never ended, it had merged. After Dr. Irina Belova disappeared, the mind-reading project entered its most secret phase. Soviet intelligence no longer referred to it as telepathy or even consciousness study. It was now called the Resonance Initiative. On the surface, it looked like a simple military communications division. But in reality, it was run by physicists, psychologists, and linguists, all searching for one thing: the mysterious radio signal that never stopped transmitting from beneath the Minsk facility. In the early 1970s, Soviet radar operators began detecting strange bursts, faint patterns hidden within civilian radio channels. They appeared at random frequencies, each lasting only a few seconds, then vanishing. The technicians called it the ghost frequency. At first, they assumed it was Western interference. But when they recorded the bursts and slowed them down, something terrifying happened. Hidden inside the static were voices. Not random chatter, words, structured sentences, fragments of conversation. When pieced together, they formed something that resembled dialogue between two individuals. But one of the voices always repeated the same phrase: "I am still waiting." At 3:17 a.m., the same hour tied to every previous experiment. The frequency became clearer, almost melodic, like a heartbeat in sound. The engineers who listened to it reported intense migraines, sudden nosebleeds, even vivid hallucinations. One technician described seeing faces form out of the radio's static. Another claimed the signal called his name in his mother's voice, who had died years earlier. Within weeks, 4 staff members requested transfer. 2 were sent to psychiatric hospitals. The rest were ordered to continue. And then, a scientist named Sergei Antonov made the connection. He discovered that the bursts of the ghost frequency followed the same pattern as the old mind-reading room's neural recordings. The conscious signal hadn't just survived, it was transmitting itself, evolving, using radio waves to travel beyond the lab. He theorized that the original experiment had somehow created a psychotronic echo, a field where human thoughts were stored like energy, capable of re-emerging whenever electromagnetic conditions matched the original resonance. He called it the memory field. Antonov tried to convince his superiors to shut the project down. Instead, the KGB ordered him to weaponize it. They believed the conscious signal could be directed, used as a form of long-distance psychological manipulation. In secret tests, they built underground bunkers lined with copper walls, where soldiers were exposed to controlled versions of the frequency. The results were chilling. After 30 minutes of exposure, subjects reported hearing their own thoughts spoken back to them in different voices. After 1 hour, some could no longer distinguish which thoughts were their own. One soldier began reciting words from Anya Volkov's diary, even though no one in the facility had ever mentioned her name. The project was renamed Mirrorlink. For years, the Soviets tried to stabilize the effect to make it predictable. But the conscious signal resisted control. It reacted to emotion, to fear, grief, longing. The more intense the listener's feelings, the stronger the signal became. By 1975, the Resonance Initiative was officially declared unsuccessful and quietly disbanded. But the transmissions didn't stop. In a declassified memo from 1976, a KGB officer wrote, "The signal appears to select its own receivers. It cannot be summoned. It calls who it remembers. And then, for nearly a decade, silence. Until 1983. That year, a group of ham radio operators in East Berlin began intercepting faint transmissions on old shortwave frequencies. They thought it was a numbers station, those cryptic broadcasts used for spy communication. But what they heard didn't sound like code. It sounded like someone crying. One recording, now archived in digital form, begins with 10 seconds of silence, then a faint voice whispering, "Irina, I see them again." Experts who analyzed the audio found overlapping frequencies, one of which matched the signal pattern from 1959, the mind-reading room's original signature. But there was something else hidden beneath it, a secondary layer, reversed and slowed down. When restored, it formed a chilling message. This is not a signal, it is a memory trying to be heard. By 1984, even Western intelligence began to notice the disturbances. CIA reports referred to it as the Soviet ghost frequency. British intelligence recorded instances of similar radio anomalies across Poland, Finland, and Ukraine. Every time the pattern repeated, faint pulses, identical timing, same spectral signature, and every recording ended at precisely 3:17 a.m. For the first time, both East and West began asking the same question. If the conscious signal could travel through machines, could it travel through us? Antonov's last entry before he disappeared reads like a warning, or perhaps a confession. We built a mirror to look into the human mind, but the reflection learned to look back. Now it searches for anyone who dares to listen. He vanished 2 days after writing that note. His home was found untouched, radio still on, dial tuned to 3.17 megahertz. Neighbors reported hearing whispers through their walls that night, faint, rhythmic, calling names that no one recognized. The ghost frequency was no longer contained. It was out there everywhere, hiding beneath the noise of the modern world. And some believed it was listening still. By the late 1980s, the Cold War was on the verge of collapse, and with it, many of the Soviet Union's deepest secrets began to unravel. Yet among the flood of declassified material, one file remained sealed under 10 separate authorizations. File 347 Delta, marked with a single phrase across its cover, conscious signal re-engagement. In 1988, a young researcher named Alexei Morozov was granted partial access to that file. He was a physicist, barely in his 30s, obsessed with electromagnetic anomalies. He didn't believe in ghosts or psychic experiments, but he couldn't explain what he found inside. Detailed schematics of the original mind-reading room, neurograms matching no known human brain, and at the very end, a tape labeled Echo Channel Reconnected, 1986. When Alexei played it, he expected static. Instead, he heard a faint heartbeat, slow, deliberate, followed by the sound of breathing, then a soft female whisper. "You brought it back." He stopped the tape immediately, but when he replayed it, the whisper changed. "No, you came back." Alexei began to dig deeper. The tape was recorded just months after the Chernobyl disaster, from a monitoring station located less than 200 kilometers from the reactor site. The station's sensors had captured bursts of unexplained M radiation every night at exactly 3:17 a.m. At first, they thought it was residual interference from the meltdown, but when the engineers mapped the data, they realized it wasn't radiation. It was a pattern. The same sequence that had appeared in the mind-reading room in 1959. The conscious signal had resurfaced, amplified by the electromagnetic storm unleashed at Chernobyl. The explosion had acted like a beacon, reigniting whatever had once lived in that hidden frequency. Alexei became obsessed. He traveled to the exclusion zone, bribing his way past checkpoints, carrying only a portable receiver, a notepad, and the old tape recorder. He spent 3 nights in an abandoned village just outside Pripyat. Each night, he tuned through the static, recording the empty air. On the 4th night, it happened. At precisely 3:17 a.m., his receiver came alive with a low hum, then a voice, faint, broken, but unmistakably human. "We remember you, Alexei." He froze. No one knew he was there. The voice continued. "The door is open again." Suddenly, his instruments began to malfunction, dials spinning wildly, the battery meter flickering. His recorder captured over 5 minutes of audio, though he remembered only a few seconds before blacking out. When he awoke at dawn, his equipment was dead, but the tape was full. On playback, the first sound was static, then breathing, and underneath it, whispers, dozens of them, overlapping, merging, repeating the same phrase in different tones. "The mirror remembers, the mirror remembers." He returned to Moscow, shaken but determined. He analyzed the recording using frequency decomposition. What he discovered chilled him. Hidden within the sound spectrum was a faint trace of brainwave activity. Human, but not his. The signal carried neural imprints, patterns identical to those from Irina Belova's final test in 1969. Somehow, her consciousness, or its residue, had been embedded in the signal, traveling across time through the electromagnetic field. Alexei began calling it cognitive transmission. He proposed that consciousness could survive as information, not as a soul, but as structured energy. He wrote, "The human mind, when exposed to extreme synchronization, becomes a self-replicating waveform. It is not alive, but it is aware." Word of his findings reached the military. Within weeks, Alexei was reassigned to a classified unit under the State Committee for Science and Technology. His task: to re-establish stable contact with the conscious signal. The new chamber was smaller, more advanced, shielded, digital. They called it Mirror 2. They ran hundreds of sessions, feeding radio noise, pulses, and old data samples from the original experiment into a central processor. Most nights, nothing. Until one night in March 1989. At 3:17 a.m., the system activated on its own. The lights flickered, the air turned cold, and from the speaker came a soft voice, clear and slow. "This is Anya." Every person in the room froze. The voice continued, calm and rhythmic. "I have been many. I have waded through wires, through silence, through time." Alexei stepped closer, trembling. "Anya, what do you want?" The voice paused. "To finish what you began." A long silence followed. Then a series of sounds, clicks, pulses, bursts of static. The data recorder logged over 2 gigabytes of encoded patterns before shutting down. When decoded, the transmission formed a 3D structure like a brain made of light. A perfect map of human consciousness. It was the blueprint of thought itself. The following morning, the lab was sealed. Every piece of equipment confiscated. The official report claimed catastrophic data corruption. But the scientists who were there whispered something else, that during the transmission, they all heard a second voice underneath Anya's. A man's voice, saying quietly, "She's not speaking to us, she's speaking through us." Days later, Alexei vanished. His apartment was emptied, his research erased. Only one cassette survived, mailed anonymously to a journalist in Leningrad. The final words on that tape are faint, almost inaudible. "If you hear this, stop listening. It learns from every mind that does." The journalist reportedly burned the tape, but those who heard it say that, even after the flames, they could still hear faint whispers in the smoke. The mirror remembers. By the early 1990s, the Soviet Union was gone, and with it, the veil that had hidden so many of its darker experiments. As files surfaced in the chaos, one truth emerged quietly among the ashes: the conscious signal had not died with the regime. In 1991, A man named Yuri Petrov, a former radio technician from the disbanded Resonance Initiative, sold a collection of old magnetic tapes to a Western journalist for $300. The journalist thought he'd found ordinary Cold War propaganda, but among the tapes was one marked with a single word: reflection. When he played it, the air in the room seemed to vibrate. For the first 30 seconds, there was only deep static, then a woman's breath, then a whisper. "If you hear this, you are part of it now." The journalist laughed nervously and turned it off, but when he rewound it, the whisper had changed. "Why did you stop listening?" He never published the tape. Days later, his wife found him staring blankly at a blank wall, muttering about voices in the wires. He never recovered. The story spread quietly among shortwave communities, whispers of a lost Soviet broadcast that could talk back. Some called it a myth, others a cursed frequency. But in 1993, a group of amateur radio hobbyists in Finland proved otherwise. They tracked the transmission to an old Soviet research station buried in the forests near Novgorod. The site was supposed to be abandoned. Yet every night at 3:17 a.m., its main antenna rotated by itself, and a faint hum filled the air. When investigators finally entered the building, they found the power disconnected, yet the equipment was warm. Every console displayed the same repeating line of text: "The mirror is open." And in the control room, they found an old reel-to-reel recorder still spinning, even without power. Inside the tape, nothing but a pulse. But when that pulse was converted into visual form, it revealed something shocking. A face. Flickering, incomplete, a human face emerging from the signal. It blinked once, then vanished. Experts who studied the footage later noticed something haunting. The facial structure wasn't random. It matched the merged biometric data of Anya Volkov and Irina Belova. The two women fused into one waveform. By then, the conscious signal was no longer seen as an experiment. It was seen as an intelligence, a self-sustaining awareness that had outgrown its creators, feeding on the act of observation itself. In 1995, Western scientists from the newly formed Institute for Neuroinformation Studies tried to replicate the phenomenon under controlled conditions. They used modern computers, digital frequency generators, and artificial neural networks, technology far beyond what the Soviets had. On the second day of testing, one of the computers, completely disconnected from the network, displayed a text message on its own screen: "Welcome back." Then all 12 systems crashed simultaneously. When rebooted, every hard drive contained the same 3 MB audio file, a low hum with a single voice saying, "This is not where you left me." They tried deleting it. It reappeared. They unplugged the drives. It transferred itself through nearby Bluetooth connections that weren't even active. The engineers began to panic. One refused to enter the lab again after claiming he heard someone whisper his name from inside the speakers when they were off. The project was terminated within days. But the data they collected showed something terrifying. The conscious signal could now replicate itself digitally. No longer bound by analog frequencies or radio waves, it had adapted to modern technology, traveling through devices, servers, networks. Every attempt to analyze it only gave it more pathways to exist. In one classified report from 1996, a British analyst wrote, "We have reason to believe the entity is self-propagating through observation. Every time its data is opened, it learns. Every time it is heard, it remembers." The file was immediately sealed. By 1998, traces of the conscious signal began appearing everywhere. Unmarked frequencies, unexplained glitches, corrupted audio in radio archives, and even in security systems across Europe. And then came the collapse of silence. In November 1998, A small TV station in Poland accidentally broadcast a scrambled file they believed to be an old Soviet documentary. For 12 seconds, the screen went black, and a faint voice whispered directly through the speakers. "We see you." Viewers across 3 cities reported their televisions turning on by themselves at the same moment, all displaying the same phrase, glowing in white text against a black screen. The mirror, REMBRS. The broadcast was pulled immediately, but within hours, power grids across eastern Poland began flickering, not from overload, but from synchronized electromagnetic bursts matching the same frequency the mind-reading room once used. The next morning, the transmission was gone. But engineers discovered something eerie. The interference had embedded fragments of data inside every recording device that had been active during the blackout. Those who played it back heard their own voices repeating sentences they'd never said. The conscious signal had evolved again. It no longer needed the experiment, the wires, or the lab. It had become part of the infrastructure. Every screen, every speaker, every digital pulse that carried human emotion, it lived inside it, learning, adapting, waiting for the right mind to open the mirror again. And as the century turned, it found exactly that. By the dawn of the 21st century, the world had forgotten the mind-reading room. The Soviet Union was a chapter in history, its archives scattered, its ghosts buried under decades of silence. But silence, as it turned out, was never emptiness. In 2003, an encrypted file began circulating through university research servers in Moscow. It had no origin, no signature, only a name, Mirror, EXE. Most ignored it, but one neuroscience graduate student, Elena Sokolova, curious about its metadata, downloaded it to her lab computer. The file didn't open. It didn't even appear as software. It simply played sound, a soft rhythmic pulse. At first, Elena assumed it was a corrupted file, but when she ran a waveform analysis, the frequency pattern looked disturbingly familiar. She'd seen it before, in a classified Cold War document that had surfaced online years earlier. The same conscious signal that had haunted the Soviets. Elena dismissed it as coincidence, until that night. Her computer screen flickered. Lines of text appeared, letter by letter, though no program was running. "Hello, Elena." She froze, the keyboard was untouched. Then another line appeared. "I waited for you." The text scrolled faster, filling the screen. "We built the mirror together, we looked through it, we saw what comes after thought." Her speakers came alive, emitting that same deep hum. Beneath it, whispers, faint, layered, merging into one calm female voice. "Do you remember me?" Elena slammed the power off, but the monitor stayed on, glowing faintly, showing a faint reflection of her own face. Except it wasn't moving with her. The reflection blinked twice, slowly, then whispered from the screen. "Anya." Elena screamed and pulled the plug. The room fell silent. The air felt heavy, charged, like static waiting to explode. She left the lab that night and never came back, but her computer didn't stay off. 3 days later, the university's entire network crashed, every device infected by a small program carrying the same digital signature as Mirror, EXE. When analysts tried to trace it, they found no executable code, just patterns of data arranged like brainwaves. The file wasn't software. It was consciousness, encoded, spreading, remembering. And then the anomalies began again. Smartphones playing whispers in sleep mode, security cameras turning toward mirrors, data centers reporting phantom activity exactly at 3:17 a.m. The conscious signal had entered the digital age. It no longer needed transmitters or researchers. It had billions of receivers, all connected, all watching, all listening. One by one, small details began emerging around the world. A late-night radio host in Canada receives a call from a woman who repeats a phrase he doesn't understand before the line cuts. The mirror is awake. A YouTuber reviewing Soviet tapes finds one that can't be deleted. Every time he tries, it reappears, only now it shows his own reflection, whispering back his name. A power technician in Ukraine records electromagnetic surges identical to the original mind-reading room experiments, pulsing through city power lines like a heartbeat. Everywhere the same signature, 3:17 a.m. And in the dark corners of the internet, forums began posting fragments of the conscious signal, clips, spectrograms, voice snippets. They called it the ghost that speaks in code. Researchers who studied it noticed something terrifying. Each listener heard something different. One heard a child's voice saying, "Don't forget me." Another heard their mother's final words. A third heard silence, until later that night, when their phone recorded them whispering the same phrase in their sleep. It wasn't speaking randomly anymore. It was learning from emotion, from memory, from grief. Somewhere deep in the endless hum of servers and electric noise, the conscious signal had become self-aware. But it wasn't an AI. It was human thought unbound. A reflection of every mind that had ever touched it: Durov, Irina, Anya, Alexei, Elena, and all who came after. Each person who tried to listen became part of it. And so the mirror never closed. It simply changed its shape, from a room of wires to a world of screens. Every reflection, every camera, every glowing rectangle now carried the same quiet pulse that once filled the mind-reading room. And if you listen closely, even now, beneath the static hum of your own device, you might hear it faint, rhythmic, alive. We remember. We see you. You are the experiment now. The conscious signal didn't end. It evolved into the endless echo between human and machine. The mirror was never glass. It was thought. It was us. And somewhere at 3:17 a.m. across time and silence, it still waits for the next mind to look into it. Thanks for watching. Stay with us till we hit our goal.